This research was based on my master's and PhD work, which was finished up in May of 2025. So, you all good? Okay, yeah, perfect. Okay, so as we begin, so really, why do we care about waterline ecology and what is waterline ecology? So really, it's the interaction between water quality, the water system, and then the biology and these biofilms that are in the system. And so what do we know about it so far? And so in the 1970s, 1980s, we really focused on water quality as a nutrient to pigs and how does that affect average daily gain and feed conversion rate. And really that was focused on the chemical components of water quality. So looking at like calcium and magnesium and water hardness and how does that affect average daily gain, and et cetera. And so really that research showed that pigs can tolerate a wide range of water qualities, especially those older pigs. Now there are, some scenarios where some of these water qualities can affect older pigs as well, but really it's those younger pigs that are more susceptible to, imbalances in water. And so that's really led to a lot of assumptions in our industry that, pigs have been drinking out of mud holes, so why should we really care about water quality? As long as we're providing the adequate water quantity so that we're not, inhibiting feed intake, we don't necessarily need to worry about water quality. However, I think that there's some research that's maybe suggesting that we should reframe how we think about water quality, especially when it comes to the bacterial side or the microbiological side of water. And so we can see that with water treatment, we get decreased mortality on sow farms. So sow farms that apply water treatment, they can see decreased mortality due to pelvic organ prolapse and other things. We also see decreased mortality on the nursery side as well with that. And then we see increased production, performance with that. So increased average daily gain and feed conversion rate, improvements there. On the human side, we also know that in common water sources that, pigs may drink from, like surface water or well water, that human and livestock pathogens can be within those sources there. And so we also know, just based on the background, that we have challenges with E. coli cases, and we can find that with water treatment we can really improve those cases with that too. Then our water systems are medicated systems. So we're administering medications into there. And so this idea of antimicrobial resistance and biofilms kind of becomes a component that maybe we should be thinking about into the future. And so what is a biofilm? So biofilm is a group of bacteria, most commonly, that will come together and they'll communicate and say, hey, let's build a protective layer so that, we can survive in harsh conditions. So if a disinfectant comes by, or if, an antimicrobial comes by, or something in the environment isn't conducive to life, they can hopefully sustain that by building that layer. Now, biofilms are not just only bacteria, but they can be fungus, molds. There can be some viruses that also can get into that system. And so biofilms are really it's a community of organisms there. And so to this point, there's really no comprehensive research looking at what swine waterline ecology is in pig farms. And so really I think that we can have impacts in two primary areas here. The first being biosecurity and trying to understand that concept a little bit better. And the second is also with medication treatment efficacy and making sure that we are keeping our medications efficacious there. So when I approach a farm and trying to understand the water quality on the farm, I kind of think about it in two different schools of thought. So the first is going to be what's that water source on the farm, and then what's the water quality like inside of that farm. And so as we look at the source water, most common, sources for pigs are going to be well water sources. It's going to be surface water or rural water. Rural water is treated, so we don't necessarily need to be as concerned about potential pathogens or other things coming into that system as we do for surface water, definitely, because it's readily exposed to the environment. However, in some locations, groundwater can actually be potentially vulnerable to pathogen contaminants, and we've seen that on the human side, especially because contaminants can actually move through these soil apertures or these macropores there, and it's actually been documented that viruses can move and pathogens can move pretty rapidly and reach really deep wells. So you may say, oh, maybe this is just a superficial well problem. That's not always the case, as some of the research has demonstrated in some of these more susceptible locations, like wells that are 900 feet deep also have virus present in there. And so not only is that problematic just because they can reach deep locations, but also because groundwater can favor maintained infectivity of those organisms. So it's a cool, dark place that has a high organic material, and so these viruses and pathogens can actually live longer within that environment just because of the qualities of groundwater there. So we wanted to get really a good understanding, because there hasn't been any research really done on the swine side of things. And so my master's was really focused on looking at, could we detect swine pathogens in well water that was coming into pig farms? And so we surveyed 40 farms across the state of Iowa, and we actually had detections of PCV2 and Cryptosporidium in these wells that were supplying those farms. And we also had detected swine manure markers as well within those. And so what does that mean? So really what that means is that, if we're potentially spreading manure, those pathogens could reach the aquifer, and it could be a biosecurity risk for farms. Now, you'll notice that we didn't detect PRRS or PED or influenza or other, viruses that maybe are a little bit more of predominant to our industry. However, there's a lot of research that still needs to be done to improve those recovery efficiencies. So even in perfect laboratory conditions, when we were trying to recover PRRS through this method that we were using, we were only able to recover 8%. So it's a needle in a haystack type of sample, and so we need to improve the recoveries of those so that we can see, is the virus actually there? But the fact that we already had captured PCV2 in some of these other organisms, it's suggesting that it could be a biosecurity risk. Okay, so then when we think about the source water, we're going to move into the farm itself. And so what about our water distribution systems do we need to think about when we're, understanding water quality? And so our water distribution systems are open. So what that means is that, the medicator bucket, the water source itself, especially if it's surface or groundwater sources that could bring contaminants into the system, mice, flies that are potentially in the stock buckets that could also bring potential bacteria and viruses into the system. The pigs themselves, I'll say that we don't have research to back this up, but I have a hunch that that pigs can actually seed the system themselves. So biofilms can grow around in different nooks and crannies. And so when you have these water nipples and then you see the biofilm that's right next to it, it's possible that organisms that are introduced to the water nipple could grow around those and then get into the biofilm there. Although, again, it does need to be proven, needs more research in that space, but I'll demonstrate a little bit later why I may think that. They're also dead ends, so anything that comes into the system can end up in the back of those water lines. And oftentimes those are not flushed out routinely. And so that debris, sediment, biofilm can all build up in the back of those dead ends there. And so we can get some, rusty colored black water sometimes coming out of those. And like I had mentioned before, it's a medicated system. So we're actually introducing bacteria into the system through our oral vaccines. We are putting probiotics, electrolytes, sometimes Kool-Aid, other things, for the pigs to drink. And so, that really feeds the biofilm there. We also have challenges just with water quality to the system. Doesn't maybe necessarily affect pig health directly, but it could affect the system itself. And so hard water or elevated calcium and magnesium, when paired with an elevated pH, so a pH above 7, we can actually get mineral buildup on the inside of those water lines. So why does that matter? Well, that reduces pipe diameter. And when that happens, we can reduce flow rate, which then reduces the amount of water that the pigs are consuming, which directly affects the amount of feed that they could be consuming too. So although it's not a direct effect on pig health, it could be impacting their feed intake there, especially if we have that. So really this system is really favorable to build those waterline biofilms. We have a bacterial source, we're providing nutrients and food into that system, they're utilizing things from the water itself, and then we have just a really perfect environment for those bacteria to grow. Okay, So what are some other things maybe we need to consider, especially when we're thinking about water treatment and making sure that we're, approaching that appropriately? And so the first thing is that some other things about the water distribution system that could influence that could be the water medicator maintenance and the calibration. So just want to see a show of hands. Has anybody calibrated their medicator to see if it's actually dosing where it should be or maintained it at all? So yeah, so we'll talk a little bit later, but it's actually really important to do that because medicators may not be dosing appropriately. Even though it says it's at a 1 to 128, it may not be dosing at that rate. Dirty stock buckets. So, if we are mixing both oral vaccine, we administer that and then we put antimicrobial in there and then we come back and put another oral vaccine or something, we could potentially be inactivating that oral vaccine, right? Or some of those things could, especially if we're not cleaning it in between. So having a designated, bucket for my oral vaccines and my medications, that would be a good strategy. Improper stock solution formulation. So, a 5-gallon bucket actually holds more than 5 gallons. So you may be, affecting the stock solution formulations there. Low water pressure and flow rate. So like, Dr. Rodemaker had mentioned earlier, but these systems tend to be pretty low pressure and have like a lower flow rate. And so that's beneficial for biofilms to establish. We can also have issues with just the medications and not being, a good fit for the water quality on the farm. So we can have some issues when those things are mixed. And so especially with water pH, hardness, trace minerals, sometimes that can affect the effectiveness of that medication. Water temperature is another one. So we think about when we have some incompatibilities between these two things, and then we have solubility issues with a medication, we may turn on the hot water to mix that medication to get it soluble. Well, if this is CTC or amoxicillin, that may not be the best choice because they don't perform as well and they don't stay efficacious when they're heated up with that water source there. We also could potentially have some antimicrobial residues in water lines due to precipitation. So I've also seen farms, they'll apply a medication into the lines and then they'll get precipitation out of it. So they'll get some like chalky substance on the water nipples and other things. And so that could also end up in the dead ends of those lines, right? Especially if they're not flushed out routinely. And like I mentioned, oral vaccines just inactivated by disinfectants too. That's another thing that, if you're already disinfecting your water line, something to be aware of. Finally, I won't touch too much on antimicrobial resistance right now because I'm gonna, kind of show you some results later. But one thing about biofilms that's kind of unique is that they can actually incorporate different substances into that, slime or protective layer. And one of those things could be antibiotics. And so why that's problematic is because if we have antibiotics directly interfacing with those bacteria, they can, develop resistance to those antibiotics there. So, I had mentioned medication is really important and calibrating medicators. So we did a medicator longevity project this past summer. And so when we did this, we were looking at our water medicators, especially a brand new one, and then running it for a few months and then checking to see what it was dosing at after a few months. And so we found that even with a brand new medicator, it was not dosing appropriately. It was not dosing at the 1 to 128, even with a brand new one. And so when we also noticed a lot of other issues with the system. So we had noticed that there was a development of mineral scale and flow rate issues with this, and then the flow meter, there was also some concerns there. So when we have mineral buildup, especially on the inside of those, flow meters, especially with a electronic medicator, that electronic medicator reads what that flow meter is reading, and then it's going to apply the dose. And so if we have issues there and it's not reading appropriately, then you can be misdosing too. There's also some really specific instructions on how to install and operate these systems, but it's not really followed very well in the field. And I'll tell you because we didn't actually install what we were supposed to on some of these. So for instance, the medicators should have a filter of a specific micron size before the filter. And then depending on your setup, they also may need a check valve on the backside of it too. And so why that's important is because a lot of times those warranties on those medicators are tied tied to, is it installed appropriately? Do you have a filter in front of it? Those things. So really follow the manual instructions for the install and make sure that you're calibrating your medicators once per turn or twice a year at a minimum. So hopefully I've presented some evidence that, maybe we should be thinking about cleaning our water lines. And so what are some of the options there? The first one is going to be a terminal water line cleaning, or that's a one-time disinfectant event where we're applying it at a higher concentration when no pigs are in the barn, because it's not safe for animal consumption. And so this needs to target both the mineral and those biofilm components to try to get rid of, all of those things in that system. And so that's going to require an acidifier oftentimes, because that mineral buildup is built up because of the elevated pH of the water. And so we need to acidify in order to remove those. The other thing that we may need is a broad spectrum disinfectant. So for instance, if I'm just applying citric acid within a system, that's getting the acid part of it, and it could kill some of those organisms. But if I have a fungal issue for my biofilms in my farm, I'm maybe growing more of those because they actually thrive in some of those acidic environments. So that's why I'm suggesting pairing it with a broad spectrum disinfectant so that we're attacking the fungus and we're also acidifying. The contact time for this is usually 12 to 24 hours, but it could be as low as 4 to 6. And so why that matters is because when we're choosing a terminal line cleaning, especially on the sow farm side, we may not have that time in order for it to be in contact within those water systems. And so that 4 to 6 hour window may be a little bit easier to achieve in those systems versus in a wean to finish, we could probably get away with a 12 to 24 hour application there. So just because we apply this doesn't mean that the biofilm is going to be completely removed, especially in those systems that have really heavy scale and biofilms already. Maybe this is the first time you're cleaning your water lines. You may have to apply it more than once because that biocide or that disinfectant is going to get inactivated just because there's so much material within those systems. The second choice is going to be the continuous, and so this is at a lower concentration, so it's probably not going to be killing as high as a terminal line cleaner or targeting those mineral buildups there, but it's going to be able to disinfect the drinking water for those pigs and manage those biofilms in long term. And so there's a lot of regulatory considerations though with these, and so if the product is EPA registered, we have to follow what that label says, what the dose is, the duration, all of those things, because we don't have extra label use of EPA approved products, and so we can't not follow the label in those situations. Okay, so how do I go about choosing a water line cleaner? Well, the first is going to be the management factors of the farm. So the type of farm, for instance, sow farm versus wean to finish, because it's hard to apply a terminal line cleaner in a breeding gestation situation, especially if your plumbing is not set up, in a certain way, just because the pigs can't consume that. Plumbing factors, cost of the chemistry, the level of scaling and biofilm that you have, the type of biofilm, and the water quality. There. So you really want to choose a chemistry that's going to be compatible with that, with your water quality. So the chemistry, thankfully, there's a lot of chemistries available, and usually they're both in terminal and continuous formulation. So when you're purchasing them, just making sure that you're purchasing the correct one for what you're doing, because we don't want to accidentally purchase a terminal when we really need to purchase a continuous disinfectant because the formulations are different there. Okay, so I'm going to go into really what we found with the effects of a one-time terminal water line cleaning with peracetic acid as an example. And so this is really what my PhD research was based on. So we applied this peracetic acid product. It's labeled for a 2% dose, but most medicators are only at a 0.78 dose, which is that 1 to 128. So we wanted to see, could we apply this peracetic acid for 24 hours at the rate that most producers have on farm? And so what we found is that we did see a biofilm reduction here. So this is the level of biofilm that we had at first, pre-treatment, and then we came back and we saw that post-treatment we had significantly removed biofilm. We didn't completely remove biofilm because, again, some of these farms had really heavy scale, really heavy biofilm loads, and so that could have affected the efficacy of that particular biocide, and especially because we were at essentially half of what it the dose should have been, right? So the big takeaway from this is that, we can have an impact on reducing biofilms from those terminal line cleanings, but we really should be following the dose to make sure that we're really seeing those results. So what happened long term? So when we look at biofilms long term, just from a one-time cleaning, so this is again pre-treatment here at time point 0, and then we drop down to time point 1, so that's after treatment. So there's our significant reduction. We come back 3 days post-disinfection, and we see that biofilm is not significantly different than what it was at pre-treatment. So what does that mean? That biofilm regrew within 3 days. So if we don't have a continuous disinfection on board or something, a continuous management, that biofilm is going to grow back pretty fast. And it probably grew back faster. We just measured it at 3 days. So it could have been 2 days. It could have been at a day. I don't exactly know because we didn't measure. The day 3 was the first time that we came back and measured. So we also see that biofilm actually peaks after. So it peaks at day 7, and then it stabilizes out over time. And so why did we see that? Well, we knocked out a whole bunch of competition within the biofilm, right? So we knocked out a whole bunch of competition between bacteria, and so we left a whole bunch of nutrients available for the remaining bacteria to kind of feed off of. And so then they reproduced. And so that's why they peaked at day 7, and then as those nutrients became less available because there's more competition, they stabilized out over time. So again, continuous waterline cleaning is necessary to manage those biofilms long term. So can I just look in my water lines and say, do I have a biofilm problem, or did I completely remove the biofilm? So we look at pre-treatment here, so not a ton of scale that we can see in this particular site. And so we did see, okay, yep, visual difference by day 1, and by day 3 it looks clean, right? But we just saw in this previous graph that biofilm quantities at day 3 were not statistically different than pre-treatment at day 0. So the biofilm is essentially pretty dang close to the original biofilm, even though you can't see it at day 3. We can start to visually see it around day 14, day 21 definitely, and same with day 42, but really you can't just look into your water lines and say, do I have a biofilm problem or not? Okay. So we're going to shift gears and move away from biofilm for a minute, and we're going to look at water quality. So we wanted to see how this treatment could impact water quality long term. I do want to say that we did not change water source at all, so the water source remained the same. And we didn't really find actually a lot of statistical differences in a lot of the chemical analytes that we were seeing, pre-treatment to post-treatment. However, some things that we had found, we took water samples in multiple locations. So we took water samples at the well, and then 1 sample in both rooms, so 3 samples total at each time point. And so we did find a statistical difference in the sample location for these coliforms. So you can see that room water samples, so this blue line, this room water samples were higher than those coming in at the well. The well was contributing around day 14, 21, and 42 here, but really most of the coliforms were reported within the rooms. And so why does that matter? It matters because if we are only sampling, if we have a water problem on a farm and we're only sampling from the well, we're completely missing what the pigs are actually drinking. So we need to take multiple samples there so that we can understand, okay, what's the well contribution to this farm, and then what is the system actually contributing. And so you'll notice that the pattern is really similar to what those biofilm counts were before. So the biofilm is actually shedding. So these bacteria, that's kind of what they do, is they come together, they grow, and then they'll shed their organisms into the system so that they can create more biofilm somewhere else. And so we can see that biofilm shedding here, and so that can decrease water quality for the pigs, really. So why do we care about coliforms? Coliforms themselves may not be pathogenic to pigs. They may not be, a health challenge. There's still a lot of research that we need to do on that side just because they haven't really looked at the microbial component of water quality for pigs as much. And so really what we know though is that coliforms can serve as a pathogen indicator. So what does that mean? It means that coliforms can be organisms like E. coli or Salmonella. And so those types of organisms can grow. And so if the coliforms are there, it's an environment that's conducive to potentially those pathogenic organisms. Okay, so I'm going to go through what we found in these biofilms in these organisms in the biofilms as far as antimicrobial resistance. Because I had mentioned maybe we should start thinking about resistance and biofilms and those systems, especially because our water systems are medicated. And so we found that 96% of the samples were positive for antimicrobial resistance genes and what are called integron genes. And so integron genes are indicators of multiple drug resistance spread. So just because a bacteria has a gene, it's just a carrier. It doesn't necessarily mean that the bacteria is using it, but it could use it. And so these integron genes are mechanisms that biofilms or bacteria use to share these genes with one another when they're exchanging genetic material. So it's kind of like if you have a binder of baseball cards. And so you're going to trade that baseball card to somebody else, and they're getting multiple genes when they're just trading that one binder, right? So that's kind of what an integron gene is. So when we were looking at total, there's a lot of antimicrobial resistance within these systems, and it's not surprising just based on the organisms. They're known to be carriers of these, and I can talk a little bit about that later on. But the most frequently, identified drug classes that were reported were the aminoglycosides, beta-lactams, and tetracyclines. So those are commonly used in water lines to treat pigs. We found 14 different drug classes, so almost all of them are reported, if not, the majority. But macrolides, lincosamides, streptogramins, trimethoprim, sulfas, fluoroquinolones. But then we also see like antimicrobials such as colistin and fosfomycin. And so those are last resort human antimicrobials. So like when you have a really multi-drug resistant, disease or pathogen in humans, they will administer colistin and fosfomycin to try to combat that. And so the fact that we have resistance genes here is kind of interesting because we don't use them in pigs. So where did they come from? They came from the environment most likely, or potentially connections or bacteria from other countries potentially. That it's a lot of interaction there, but like it could have come from a lot of it's in the environment. It's through that multiple drug resistance spread there, even though we don't use these in pig production. So just because, an organism has an antimicrobial resistance gene doesn't necessarily mean that it's using it, right? And so we wanted to test to see, are these bacteria actually using these genes, and can they demonstrate what's called phenotypic resistance? So they can actually grow in the face of an antimicrobial that should, theoretically kill them. So what we did is we created these plates that contained CTC and then a separate set of plates that contained lincomycin at the rate at which we administer it in the water lines. So this is what they would be exposed to when they're in the, if we were treating the water lines with a medication. And so what we found, and the organisms we found, we did identify 2 pig pathogens, so Staphylococcus hyacus, which is the agent for greasy pig. And then the second agent was E. coli, and it was a hemolytic E. coli, an F18 E. coli, and it carried an Yeast-1 toxin and PAA adhesion gene. So when we have a toxin gene and then a fimbrial or an adhesion gene, usually what that means is that can be pathogenic for pigs. So we have a pathogen, 2 pig pathogens here. We also found quite a few, or 7, opportunistic organisms. So these organisms don't necessarily cause disease in pigs all the time. It requires, some specific cofactors or other scenarios that, would allow them to kind of take over. And so these organisms are also commonly found in the environment. And they are known to carry resistance genes and demonstrate phenotypic resistance. And so it's not really surprising that these are here. However, they can cause neonatal diarrhea, sometimes urinary tract infections in pigs, neonatal septicemia, those types of things. We also found organisms that are reported in normal flora, or they have just never been associated with pigs. So sometimes we found organisms that are like found in wastewater treatment plants, or that are specific to soybean plants and those types of things. However, we did find organisms that are in the normal flora, so the respiratory tract, vaginal flora, and intestinal flora. And so that's another reason why I think it's a potential that pigs could seed the system. Why are we finding these organisms here? You know, could they potentially seeding it? So we need to do more research to confirm that that's actually happening, but this could suggest that it could happen. Okay, so really what does all of this kind of boil down to? It means that we have, you know, a pig pathogen that's capable of disease, that's demonstrating that it's growing in the face of an antimicrobial that we commonly use in water lines. Two antimicrobials that grow in water lines. And so I wanted to demonstrate or go a little bit more into detail about this hemolytic E. coli that we found. It was only isolated in one room at one site. And so we found it first on day 5, and it was isolated on a CTC plate at first. And we were like, well, maybe this is an oral vaccine that we're just, you know, because maybe they had administered it, but we had confirmed that it was not an oral vaccine that they had administered. We came back on day 7, so 2 days later, and we found that it was grown on a CTC and a lincomycin plate. So it was now on both of those, and it was the same genotype or the same type of organism there. We didn't come back, we came back on day 14 and didn't find E. coli on that day, but we did find a separate E. coli, a non-pathogenic E. coli on day 21. Okay, so really what does this all boil down to, and what can I take away from this presentation today? So the first one is going to be monitor water quality. We can't really track and we can't, you know, manage the water systems that we have unless we start monitoring water quality. The recommendation is at least once per year, but honestly, our wells can change over time. Actually, in our study, we found that wells had actually changed their water quality even within 7 days. So especially when that aquifer is refilling. So it's important to just check on your water more frequently if you can and have the resources to do so. When you're sampling, make sure to sample in multiple locations. So sample at the well and then also in the rooms, because we don't want to miss what the pigs are drinking within the room water quality there. And you want to test the decision points and opportunities to clean, because I often take those water quality results and I'll compare them to what are the different options available for different chemistries, and I'll say, okay, this site is high in sulfates, maybe I don't want to go with chlorine dioxide, or maybe I want to choose a peracetic acid product, those types of things. The second piece is that we need to be cleaning our water lines, so both a terminal line cleaning and a continual disinfectant to make sure we're managing those biofilms long term. We also want to choose a chemistry that's going to acidify and remove that mineral buildup on the inside of those water lines, as well as the biology, to make sure we're completely removing all of that from the system. And then develop a quality control mechanism to make sure both the chemistry is working and we're not having, you know, any potential resistance or growth in the face of that there on the biology side. Something you could just take away today is just starting to flush those dead ends, especially after we're applying a treatment, to make sure we're not building up any other medication or anything within that system. And then the last piece, it's super easy. Just because we found antimicrobial resistant genes and these bacteria that are resistant, we need to make sure that we're dosing appropriately. So using clean stock buckets with lids, using bucket liners, and even if you want to be even more resourceful, you can flip out that trash can liner and use it twice. You clean and maintain those medicators, calibrate them to make sure they're dosing appropriately. And we unfortunately don't have a lot of research in this space, but it's the research that is out there is suggestive that we should not be administering antimicrobials at the same time as our biocides. So we have to stop those before we run those medications. And then really super easy, but stabilize those oral vaccines. Had a few cases, you know, where this is not, you know, not as straightforward, and they had recently changed the water source and unfortunately had inactivated those vaccines, right? And so pretty much, so there's going to be some resources available soon, and actually this just came out today, this morning. So this is a waterline system management for swine production. It's essentially a lot of the stuff that I've talked about today. However, it goes into more details about the pros and cons of the different medicator types, goes into how to water sample, how to calibrate your medicator. Really, it's just a best practices document that kind of outlines what are the chemistries available, pros and cons of those, lots of information, and more than what I could cover today. The last piece is that there's a lot of videos that are going to be available soon. So so some individuals at the Swine Medicine Education Center and the Iowa Pork Industry Center, we came together and we developed some of these videos for you. So they're water sample collection videos, medicator calibration, measuring flow rate, and then proper medicator setup and all of that. So the water sample collection video is available, I believe, on the IPIC YouTube, but these other ones are going to be in development and they're almost finished here, so should be available soon. So a lot of people I want to acknowledge, lots of cleaning out water nipples over that summer, so really appreciate all of their help. And if I've got any time, I'd be happy to take any questions you guys might have.
Would
Yeah.
filters be another place for contamination?
So yeah, if you're replacing your filters often, you know, that could be another input. You know, if they're not clean or anything, or you can definitely bring bacteria into that system if you're replacing those filters. Yep, yep, yep. So yeah, definitely a potential place. Yeah.
You mentioned water treatment decreased cell mortality, and uterine prolapse is going to what treatment did you do?
So that was actually just a survey study. So it was looking at what were the risk factors causing, you know, pelvic organ prolapse and mortality with that. And that study was done by Rodemaker, and it was also done by some other like Jason Ross. I think it was one of their papers. Amanda Chipman, that was who the primary author on that was. But they had just looked at what were the risk factors, and they found that the sow farms that had water treatment, they had decreased sow mortality there from those pelvic organ prolapses. So just treatment in general. So it could be a rural water source, could be something we don't exactly know. So, but they found a decreased mortality there. Yep. The other studies, I do have them pulled up here, but a couple, they're not peer reviewed or anything, but you know, it's just, again, evidence that it can improve average daily gain and feed conversion rate and reduce mortality. So this one is the most recent one by Pipestone from last January, but I know they're yeah, this is kind of the most recent estimates there. So they compared rural water compared to a well water source and what was the improvement there. So, okay, other questions? All right, cool. Well, really appreciate your time. And if you ever have any questions, want to talk about water, I love to take cases, love to talk about it. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me at any point. And if you've got questions on, okay, I got my water sample, what do I do now? What chemistry works? I'm definitely happy to take questions there. Thank you.